So, whatever happened to the giant classic robot from the 1950s sci-fi film TOBOR the Great? Let's find out. Movies,
Music and monsters.
Hey guys, Dan Monroe here, talking about movies, music, and monsters. Oh man, do I absolutely love me a good old classic 1950s black and white sci-fi flick. Now, before we get started, I have to thank the robot man himself, the incredibly talented Fred Barton, for not only supplying me with very crucial information about this classic sci-fi robot, but also for letting me in on a lot of very interesting secrets about this wild and crazy story about TOBOR the Great. The 1950s is often referred to as the classic or golden era of science fiction theater, with well over 200 sci-fi films produced during that time. It actually holds the world record for the largest number of sci-fi movies produced in any given decade. Yes, a lot of the old films definitely seemed a bit on the lower budget side, targeted at a younger teenage audience, and a lot of the themes seemed to be based on public concerns of the day, like infiltration, fear of nuclear weapons, and invasion and threats to humanity. Campy? A little. B-movies? Yeah, for the most part, but definitely a lot of fun on a Saturday afternoon in your local cinema with a bag of stale popcorn. We had the man from Planet X, zombies of the stratosphere, robot monster, killers from space, the crab monsters, the brain eaters, and so many more. We could be here all day. Just good, clean, somewhat silly 1950s sci-fi brainless fun. However, the 1950s also gave us, in my opinion, some of the greatest sci-fi films ever made. So many timeless classics that not only thrilled audiences back in the day, but were also laying the foundation for all the future science fiction classics that we've grown to love since that time. Now, I'm not really sure which of the two categories you would personally fit this film into, but in 1954, Republic Pictures gave us TOBOR the Great. And yes, that's robot spelled backwards. The heartwarming story of a boy, his robot, and of course, foreign espionage. There were a ton of classic robot designs throughout the course of sci-fi cinematic history. Gort, Robbie the Robot, the Lost in Space robot, but the one guy who seemed to get maybe a little overlooked is our old buddy TOBOR. And this guy was not only a robot, but a sentient being equipped to decipher ESP messages. I wonder if that's where Vincent from the Black Hole got his programming. And yes, TOBOR does still exist, and we'll get to that in just a second, but the history of what happened to TOBOR is so bizarre you might not even believe it. TOBOR the Great was distributed by Republic Pictures, written by Carl Dudley and Philip McDonald, and starred Charles Drake, Karen Booth, and Billy Chapin. The basic storyline revolves around Dr. Ralph Harrison teaming up with his colleague Professor Nordstrom to develop a robot named TOBOR, which ends up being stolen by enemy agents who wish to reprogram the robot for their evil purposes. The film definitely has that 1950s American Leave It to Beaver style vibe with the perfect happy housewife, the kindly old grandfather, and of course the outrageously brilliant young boy, kind of like Will Robinson, who actually ends up being a pretty integral part of the story. As unrealistic as it was, the innocence of those movies from the 1950s was just so 1950s. Especially the way the men and the women talked to each other if there was like any romantic involvement going on. I have to put my car away. Would you like to help me? Yes, I would very much like to. Yeah, I mean, there's no subliminal messages going on there. I mean, golly gee willikers. Classic 1950s stuff. Principal photography for TOBOR the Great took place January 1954 at the Inversion Movie Ranch in Chatworth, California. Now, a lot of people out there just automatically assumed that this robot was designed by Robert Kinoshita, who created the Lost in Space robot and Robbie the Robot. Let's get this out of the way right now. He didn't. TOBOR was designed by Gabriel Scognamiglio and built by Mel Arnold, who also worked on Gort for The Day the Earth Stood Still. And yes, there was a guy inside TOBOR, quite obviously. His name was Lewis Smith, and even though he was uncredited for his role in the film, he did do a ton of acting work in the 50s and 60s, like The Lieutenant in 1963 and The Mickey Rooney Show in 1954. Yeah, the dialogue was clunky and the acting was about what you'd expect, but you gotta admit, the robot was really super cool. And you know, I really liked and respected the way that the writers and directors chose not to give TOBOR a voice. Sometimes in some of these cheesy sci-fi flicks, the robot looks really cool, but just sounds so ridiculous.
I am TOBOR the Great. I am here to protect you.
I'm so glad this awesome mechanical machine didn't have any 1950s cheesy dialogue. Now, there was only one TOBOR the Robot created for this film. Again, this wasn't the highest budgeted film of the 50s, and I'm pretty sure there was just no reason to create a second one. The film was, however, filled with tons of really neat gizmos and gadgets like TOBOR's sonic remote controller, which also still does exist today. Okay, but what happened to TOBOR? Well, when the film was completed and all the publicity stuff was done to promote the film, TOBOR was basically just crated up and put into storage at Republic Pictures. But eventually, Republic Pictures went belly up, and all those costumes and props basically just ended up in a large storage facility. You know, kind of like the stuff you would see on Storage Wars. So years and years passed, like 50 years, and nobody really knew where any of this stuff was, or for that matter, really cared where any of this stuff was, and it was all simply presumed lost. However, urban legend claims that in the 1960s, Bob Burns was hot on the trail of trying to obtain TOBOR the Robot, and he found out, supposedly, that the robot was in this particular storage facility. Apparently, he called about it, but was told that it was stolen. I can't confirm or deny that he tried to get the prop, but I do know that he clearly didn't end up with it. But then in the early 2000s, the storage facility that housed all these Republic props was going out of business, so the contents were all sold. Luckily, however, a fairly prominent antique dealer from the East Coast purchased that particular locker, TOBOR included. Now, Fred Barton is literally sitting at home when suddenly the phone rings. And a strange female voice tells Fred, in kind of an unusual tone, "I've got TOBOR." Like, really? Sounds more like some kidnapping ransom call. And here's where things get really bizarre. So it turns out that this woman lives back east and is or was some 6'3" tall female wrestler who was apparently into some bizarre fetish dominatrix and had TOBOR the Great at her house down in her own personal dominatrix dungeon. You heard me right. Apparently, for whatever reason, I guess the antique dealer who was also into this dominatrix stuff ended up giving her TOBOR the robot. There is no way to make this stuff up. Can you imagine TOBOR the robot down in a dominatrix dungeon? So, Fred flies out to the East Coast and does indeed confirm that this is the one and only TOBOR the Great. Fred eventually took TOBOR and the sonic remote from the film back to LA.
Not only did she call me, but I called John Rigg. We flew out together. This is really an important piece. The only thing that had changed, TOBOR actually has a matte finish. They went out, had him polished, and somebody had put a heater grill and took all his guts out of his chest.
And now that TOBOR was safely in the hands of a professional restoration artist, Fred began by cleaning and analyzing every single part, even though 90% of this prop miraculously was still original and in excellent condition. The original chest plate was missing. Someone had put heater vents or something on it at some point. So Fred meticulously recreated the look of the original perfect chest section. And there he is, TOBOR the Great, completely restored and looking, if I may say so, just robotically gorgeous. And where is TOBOR today? Well, he is happily and safely in the hands of a private collector. And by the way, if anybody out there wants to own their very own museum-quality robot replica, visit Fred Barton's website at the-robotman.com. The work that this guy does with robots is the finest in the world, and Fred Barton Productions, link in the description. Well, TOBOR the Great came and TOBOR the Great went, but that certainly wasn't the end of this particular character. The film inspired a TOBOR the Great comic book series written by Dennis Gifford, which appeared in Star Comics number 1 and 2 back in 1954. And this is really interesting. Back in 1956, a pilot episode was filmed for a possible TV series called Here Comes TOBOR. The project was never picked up, but the pilot was filmed and sadly never aired. And then in 2011, Diamond World Pictures announced that they were planning to do a sequel to TOBOR the Great. Apparently, this was a new film company at the time and was going to use the TOBOR sequel as their launching off point into Hollywood movie making. And get this, the film was supposedly planning to use Patrick Dempsey and Christopher Plummer to star in the film, along with stop-motion animation. How cool would that have been? Stop-motion TOBOR, I'm in. But unfortunately, never happened. On a quick side note, if anybody out there is interested in some really super cool sci-fi podcasts, check out the Forces Behind Science Fiction podcast, featuring interviews and insights from the creative forces behind your favorite science fiction shows, movies, and books. Really cool stuff. Link in the description. TOBOR the Great was released on DVD in 2008 by Lionsgate Home Entertainment, even though, and this is really sort of interesting, on the DVD, the film was released in the incorrect aspect ratio of an open matte transfer, or basically square 4:3. The film was originally shot and intended to be viewed in the widescreen aspect ratio. That being said, TOBOR the Great has since been released on Blu-ray in its correct theatrical aspect ratio, and man, does this film look great. Saturday afternoon popcorn movie indeed. Now, the 1950s not only gave us a huge collection of fun and memorable sci-fi flicks, but firmly established the sci-fi genre as a popular and lasting icon of cinematic history. The Blob, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Thing from Another World, Forbidden Planet, This Island, Earth, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and so many more. We could be here all day, but that, my friends, is the topic of another video. I really hope you guys enjoyed that deep dive into what happened to TOBOR the Great, and if you did and you like this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing to the channel. I've got a whole ton of new videos coming up really soon that I know you guys are just gonna dig. As always, if anybody has any questions, drop them down in the comments, and I will do my best to try to answer them for you. And please feel free to stop back anytime as we continue our conversation on movies, music, and monsters. Movies,
Music and monsters.